Hey everyone, my name is Alex Rivera. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been around for a while, thank you for coming back. Before I start this story, I need you to know something important. What you're about to hear is not a movie script, not a dramatized internet tale, and not something I made up for views. This is what actually happened to me. 9 years ago, I was a third-year medical student at one of the top schools in the country. My entire family are doctors. My father is a cardiac surgeon. My mother is a pediatrician. My older brother is an orthopedic specialist. My younger sister was already accepted into medical school when I was still in my clinical rotations. In our house, medicine wasn't just a career. It was the only acceptable identity. It was the family religion. I grew up in a home where the dinner table conversation was never about sports, never about movies, never about ordinary life. It was about cases. My father would describe valve replacements the way other dads talked about weekend golf. My mother would light up discussing rare pediatric syndromes. My brother already knew the names of every bone in the human body by the time he was 12. I was the quiet one. The one who preferred drawing diagrams of the circulatory system rather than memorizing them. The one who stayed up late reading novels instead of practice questions. Still, I did what was expected. I got the grades. I got into the same prestigious medical school my brother had attended. The family was proud. Relieved, even. The Rivera name would continue unbroken. By third year, the cracks were already there. I hated the hospital smell. I hated the way patients became beds and cases. I hated that every time I looked at a human being in pain, the only thing I was trained to feel was the next step in the protocol. One night after a particularly brutal trauma rotation, I sat in my car and cried for 40 minutes. Not because I was tired, because I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. I told my parents I wanted to take a leave of absence. My father's face went still. My mother's voice dropped into the tone she used with non-compliant patients. "This is temporary exhaustion," she said. "You will finish." I didn't. 3 months later, I formally withdrew from medical school. That was the day the family stopped existing for me. There was no dramatic shouting match. That would have been almost kinder. Instead, there was a carefully worded email from my father, copied to my mother and brother. "We have discussed this as a family. Your decision demonstrates a fundamental lack of character and commitment. Until you return to the path you abandoned, you are no longer welcome in this household or at family events. Do not contact us. We will not respond." My sister sent a separate message. "I'm sorry, I love you, but I can't go against them." That was the last message I received from any of them for 9 years. I moved across the country with 2 suitcases and a half-finished medical education that was now worthless. I worked construction, then night security. Then I taught myself graphic design. Eventually, I built a small design studio that paid the bills and gave me something that felt like purpose. I never stopped missing them. I just learned to live around the missing piece. 9 years later, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. It was from my sister's wedding planner. "You are invited to the wedding of Isabella Rivera and Michael Chen. Your presence is requested by the bride." No note from my sister, no explanation, just the formal invitation. I bought a plane ticket. I walked into that wedding, and my mother said something that shattered me completely. If you've ever been cut off by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, if you've ever had to rebuild your entire life after your family decided you no longer existed, if you've ever stood in a room full of people who used to be your whole world and realized you had become a stranger to them, this story is for you. Before I go any further, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. It really helps the channel grow and lets more people who need this kind of story find it. And if this video resonates with you at all, leave a like. It costs nothing and means everything to creators like me. Drop a comment too if you've ever been through something similar. I read as many as I can. Alright, let's begin. I grew up in a house where the dinner table conversation was never about sports or movies or ordinary life. It was about cases. My father would describe valve replacements the way other dads talked about weekend golf. He would sketch the heart on a napkin between bites of food, explaining the difference between a bicuspid and a tricuspid valve with the same calm precision he used in the operating room. My mother would light up discussing rare pediatric syndromes, her voice rising with genuine excitement when she talked about a diagnosis she had finally confirmed after weeks of uncertainty. My older brother already knew the names of every bone in the human body by the time he was 12. He used to quiz me at breakfast, pointing to his own elbow or collarbone and waiting for the correct Latin term. In our house, medicine wasn't just a career. It was the family religion. The Rivera name carried weight in the hospital corridors. My father was a respected cardiac surgeon. My mother was a pediatrician known for her sharp clinical mind. My brother was already on the same path, collecting perfect scores and early acceptances like trophies. My younger sister, still in high school when I started college, spoke about medical school the way other teenagers spoke about college parties. There was never any question about what we would become. The only question was how high we would rise within the profession. I was the quiet one. I did well enough. I got the grades. I scored high on the entrance exams. I was accepted into the same prestigious medical school my brother had attended 2 years earlier. The family was proud, relieved even. The line would continue unbroken. At gatherings, relatives would smile and say things like, "Another doctor in the family," as if it were already decided and celebrated. For a while, I tried to believe it was what I wanted too. I memorized the pathways. I stayed late in the anatomy lab. I learned to speak the language of medicine fluently enough that no one questioned my place there. But something inside me never settled. While my classmates grew more certain with every rotation, I felt myself growing quieter. I preferred drawing diagrams of the circulatory system rather than memorizing them for exams. I stayed up late reading novels instead of practice questions. I found myself watching patients longer than necessary, not because I was analyzing their symptoms, but because I was trying to see the person underneath the chart. By third year, the cracks were already visible, at least to me. I hated the hospital smell, that sharp mix of disinfectant, floor wax, and something faintly metallic that clung to your clothes long after you left. I hated the way patients became beds and cases in conversation, reduced to room numbers and primary diagnoses. I hated that every time I looked at a human being in pain, the only thing I was trained to feel was the next step in the protocol. Compassion was allowed, but only in measured doses. Efficiency was the real currency. One night after a particularly brutal trauma rotation, I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and cried for 40 minutes. Not because I was tired. Not because the case had been especially graphic. Because I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could look at suffering and immediately start calculating the next clinical move instead of simply feeling the weight of it. Someone who was slowly trading pieces of himself for a title that looked perfect from the outside and felt hollow from the inside. I told my parents I wanted to take a leave of absence. We were sitting in the living room of the house I grew up in. My father was still in his scrubs from a late case. My mother had just finished reviewing charts at the dining table. I spoke carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. I said I needed time. I said I wasn't sure medicine was the right path. I said I felt like I was disappearing inside the role everyone expected me to fill. My father's face went still. My mother's voice dropped into the tone she used with non-compliant patients. "This is temporary exhaustion," she said. "You will finish." There was no room in the sentence for disagreement. No space for the possibility that I might be telling the truth about what I felt. In their world, doubt was a symptom to be treated, not a signal to be respected. I tried to explain again. I talked about the nights I couldn't sleep. The growing sense that I was living someone else's life. The fear that if I kept going, I would wake up at 40 successful, respected, and completely empty. My father listened without interrupting. When I finished, he simply said, "You are a Rivera. We do not quit." That was the end of the conversation. 3 months later, after one final failed attempt to force myself back into the shape they required, I formally withdrew from medical school. That was the day the first real crack in the perfect family became a clean break. I didn't know yet how complete the break would be. I only knew that for the first time in my life, I had chosen the truth of what I felt over the story everyone else needed me to live. And the cost of that choice was only beginning. There was no dramatic shouting match, no slammed doors, no tears in the living room. That would have been almost kinder. Instead, there was silence and then an email. I still remember the exact time it arrived, 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was sitting on a mattress on the floor of a cheap studio apartment 2 states away, eating cold leftover rice out of a takeout container, trying to figure out how I was going to pay rent in 3 weeks. My phone lit up. The subject line was blank. The sender was my father's professional email, addressed the same one he used to send patient referrals and hospital administration messages. I opened it. "We have discussed this as a family. Your decision demonstrates a fundamental lack of character and commitment. Until you return to the path you abandoned, you are no longer welcome in this household or at family events. Do not contact us. We will not respond." That was it. No greeting, no "Dear Alex," no closing, just those 4 sentences, clinical and final like a discharge summary. I read it 3 times. Then I read it again, slower, waiting for the part where they said they still loved me, or that they needed time, or that the door was still open if I changed my mind. That part never came. 20 minutes later, a second message arrived, this one from my sister's personal email. "I'm sorry, I love you, but I can't go against them." I stared at those 2 short lines until the screen went dark. Then I turned the phone face down on the floor and sat in the quiet for a long time. The next morning, I tried calling my mother. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message. I tried again that evening. Same result. I texted my brother. The message stayed on delivered. I emailed my father asking if we could just talk for 5 minutes. The reply came back almost immediately. "As previously stated, there will be no further communication." That was the last time any of them ever responded to me for 9 years. What followed was not a clean break. It was a slow, grinding erasure. Birthdays passed with no calls. Christmases arrived with no invitations. My grandmother's funeral happened without me knowing until weeks later, when I saw a photo someone had posted online. My name was not mentioned in the obituary. When I finally worked up the courage to message a cousin, she replied, "I was told not to talk about you." I stopped existing in their world the way a medical error gets quietly deleted from a chart. I moved farther away. I took whatever work I could find. Construction during the day, night security at a warehouse. Later, I taught myself graphic design on a second-hand laptop in the library because I couldn't afford classes. I built a small freelance business that eventually became a studio. I made friends. I dated. I learned how to cook for one. I learned how to sit with the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being erased by the people who raised you. But some nights, especially in the beginning, I would still open my email and scroll back to that message from my father. I would read the words again, searching for any crack in the language, any hint of regret that I had somehow missed the first 100 times. There never was one. They had decided, as a family, that the son who walked away from medicine was no longer theirs. And they meant it. 9 years, that's how long it had been since the email. 9 years of birthdays that passed in silence. 9 years of Christmases spent with friends who had become family by choice. 9 years of carefully learning how to live without the people whose last name I still carried. I had built a life. Not the one my parents planned, but one that felt honest. My design studio had grown from a second-hand laptop in a public library into a small but steady business. I had a quiet apartment with plants that actually stayed alive. I had a couple of close friends who knew the whole story and never once made me feel like a failure for walking away from medicine. Most days, I was okay. Then the email arrived. It came on a Thursday afternoon while I was finishing a client presentation. The sender wasn't a family member. It was a professional wedding planning company. The subject line was formal and polite. I stared at it for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a clean, elegant digital invitation. Soft ivory background, delicate script, the date, the venue, a vineyard an hour outside the city where I grew up. And at the bottom, in smaller text, your presence is requested by the bride. No personal note. No, I hope you'll come. No explanation for 9 years of silence, just the formal request. I closed the laptop and sat very still. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately. Another part, the part that still remembered the sound of my sister's laugh when we were kids, the way she used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, wanted to go. I hated that part of myself for still caring. I hated that after everything, the idea of seeing her walk down the aisle still mattered. I didn't reply for 3 days. I told myself I was thinking it over. Really, I was waiting to see if anyone else from the family would reach out. A text from my sister. A short email from my mother. Anything that suggested this invitation was more than a polite obligation. Nothing came. On the 4th day, I opened the invitation again and RSVP'd yes. Alone. No +1. I bought the plane ticket that same night. Economy. Non-refundable. I told myself that if I changed my mind, I could just not show up. But deep down, I already knew I would. The week before the wedding, I barely slept. I kept replaying possible scenarios in my head. Would they ignore me completely? Would someone pull me aside and try to smooth things over? Would my father look at me the way he used to when I brought home a less-than-perfect grade? I packed a simple black suit. I got a haircut. I practiced what I would say if anyone actually spoke to me. Most of the versions ended with me walking out early. The night before my flight, I stood in my apartment and looked around at the life I had built without them. The framed prints on the walls, the coffee mug with a crack I refused to throw away, the quiet that no longer felt empty. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door, and left for the airport. I was going back. I just didn't know yet that walking into that wedding would cost me the last piece of hope I still had left. The vineyard looked exactly like the photos on the invitation's soft golden light, rows of grapevines stretching toward the hills, white chairs arranged in perfect lines under a canopy of string lights. It was the kind of place my family would choose. Elegant, expensive, carefully curated. Nothing left to chance. I arrived early on purpose. I told myself it was so I could find a quiet corner and settle my nerves. Really, I was giving myself an exit route if everything went wrong the second I stepped out of the car. I sat in the rental for almost 20 minutes with the engine off, hands tight on the steering wheel. My black suit felt too formal and not formal enough at the same time. I kept checking my phone even though no one was going to text me. Old habit. Finally, I got out. The gravel path leading toward the ceremony area felt longer than it should have. Every step made the distance between the life I had built and the one I had left behind feel sharper. Guests were already arriving, some I recognized from childhood. Others were strangers in expensive clothes. A few people glanced at me, then looked away quickly, the way people do when they recognize a face they're not supposed to acknowledge. The first person from my family who saw me was my brother. He was standing near the entrance with a drink in his hand, talking to one of the groomsmen. The moment his eyes landed on me, the conversation stopped. His face went through 3 clear stages in under 2 seconds. Shock, anger, then something colder and more controlled. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He simply turned his body away from me and continued the conversation as if I had never existed. I kept walking. My father was near the front, speaking with the officiant. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, grayer at the temples, the same rigid posture. When he noticed me, he paused for half a second. Then he gave me the smallest possible nod, the exact same nod he used to give residents who had disappointed him on rounds. No words, no expression, just that single, clinical acknowledgement before he turned back to the conversation. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Near the gift table, I found my sister. She looked beautiful. The dress, the hair, the soft glow of someone on their wedding day. The second she saw me, her face crumpled with a mix of relief and guilt. She crossed the space between us quickly and hugged me hard, the way she used to when we were kids and something had gone wrong. "Thank you for coming," she whispered against my shoulder. I know it wasn't easy. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. She pulled back, eyes shining, and opened her mouth like she wanted to say more, but then her gaze shifted past my shoulder and the expression on her face changed. I turned. My mother was standing a few feet away. She looked almost exactly the same and completely different at the same time. Same sharp eyes, same perfect posture, same carefully controlled expression, but there were new lines around her mouth and something harder behind her gaze. She stopped 3 feet from me. The string quartet kept playing. Guests laughed somewhere behind us. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees like nothing in the world was wrong. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The string quartet continued playing somewhere behind us. Soft violin, gentle cello, guests laughed and clinked glasses. The late afternoon light still filtered golden through the trees. Everything around us looked like a perfect wedding. My mother stood 3 feet away from me, perfectly composed, and looked at me the way she used to look at a difficult diagnosis. Then she said the first sentence. "You should not have come." It landed flat and final, like a door closing. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My sister's hand tightened on my arm. My father's posture stiffened a few feet away. My brother kept his eyes on the ground. My mother wasn't finished. She took a small step closer, just enough so that only the people nearest us could hear, and delivered the second sentence with the same calm, clinical precision she had always used when delivering bad news to parents of sick children. "We already told people you were dead." 6 words. That was all it took. The world didn't tilt or spin, it just stopped. The music kept playing, but it suddenly sounded far away. The golden light still fell across the grass, but it no longer felt warm. My sister made a small, broken sound beside me. My father's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jump. My brother still wouldn't look up. No one corrected her. No one said, "That's not true." No one said, "She doesn't mean that." No one stepped forward. They just stood there and let the words hang in the air between us like something that had already been decided years ago. I understood then, with a clarity that felt almost physical, what the last 9 years had actually been. They hadn't simply cut me off. They had rewritten the story. In their version of the family, the son who walked away from medicine had died. It was cleaner that way, easier to explain at dinner parties and hospital fundraisers. Easier than admitting that one of their children had chosen a different life and still existed somewhere out in the world. A dead son was tragic. A living son who refused to become a doctor was an embarrassment. I don't remember deciding to leave. I only remember the feeling of the evening air hitting my face as I walked back down the gravel path toward the parking lot, the sound of the string quartet fading behind me, and the absolute, hollow certainty that the last small piece of hope I had carried for 9 years had just been extinguished under string lights at my sister's wedding. No one followed me. Not my sister. Not my father. Not my brother. And certainly not my mother. I sat in the rental car with the doors locked and both hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing, while the words replayed on a loop in my head. "We already told people you were dead." Some sentences don't just hurt. They rewrite the entire story of who you thought you were to the people who raised you. That was the moment everything finally broke. I sat in the rental car in the parking lot for almost an hour. The sun had started to drop behind the hills. The string lights in the distance grew brighter as the sky darkened. Every so often a guest would walk past, laughing, carrying a drink, completely unaware that something irreversible had just happened a few dozen yards away. No one came after me. Not my sister, not my father, not my brother, not a single relative or old family friend. I kept waiting for the sound of footsteps on gravel, for a knock on the window, for any sign that anyone felt the weight of what had just been said. It never came. The wedding continued without me, the way the family had continued without me for 9 years. Eventually, I started the car and drove. I don't remember most of the route back to the hotel. I only remember the way my hands stayed locked on the steering wheel and the way my mother's voice kept repeating those 6 words in my head like a stuck recording. Asterisk, we already told people you were dead. Later that night, while I sat on the edge of the hotel bed still wearing the black suit, my phone lit up with a text from my sister. I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was going to say that. Please don't hate me. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I locked the screen without replying. 2 days later, after I had flown home, another message arrived. This one from my father's email addressed the same formal, professional account he had used to disown me 9 years earlier. Your presence caused unnecessary disruption. Do not contact the family again. No greeting, no closing. Just those 2 sentences, as clean and final as a surgical incision. I didn't reply to that one either. In the weeks that followed, something shifted inside me that had still been holding on by a thin, stubborn thread. For 9 years, I had carried a quiet, private hope, the kind you don't admit out loud even to yourself. The hope that maybe, someday, they would simply miss me enough to want me back as I was. Not as a doctor. Not as the version of me that fit their story. Just as their son. That hope died in a vineyard parking lot under string lights. I went back to work. I answered emails. I met with clients. I watered the plants in my apartment. From the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, it felt like a room I had kept carefully locked for years had finally been emptied out. There was no anger left to burn. No arguments left to rehearse. No imagined conversations where they finally understood. Just a wide, quiet space where the last piece of waiting used to live. Some nights I still opened the old email thread and scrolled back to the original message from 9 years ago, then to the wedding texts, then to my father's final note. I read them in order, like chapters in a story that had reached its inevitable ending. Then I closed the phone and went to sleep. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. And in that quiet, I finally understood that the door had not just been closed. It had been locked from the other side a long time ago. After the wedding, I went home and did the only thing I knew how to do when everything inside me felt broken. I worked. I threw myself into the studio the way some people throw themselves into grief. Early mornings. Late nights. Back-to-back client projects. I expanded the business, hired 2 freelancers, took on larger contracts than I normally would have accepted. On paper, it looked like ambition. In reality, it was survival. As long as I stayed busy, the quiet in my chest stayed manageable. The first few months were the hardest. Certain songs on the radio would catch me off guard. A stranger's laugh in a coffee shop would sound too much like my sister's. I would see a father and son walking together and feel something sharp and brief before I looked away. Those moments still came, but they no longer knocked the air out of me the way they used to. They just passed through, like weather. I stopped checking the old family email threads. I stopped looking at childhood photo albums. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Instead, I started paying attention to the life that was actually in front of me. There was the client who cried when she saw the final designs for her small business rebrand, telling me it was the first time her company finally felt like her. I mentored who later told me my feedback had kept him from quitting the industry entirely. There were quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and no one to impress. There were friends who showed up without conditions, the kind of people who chose me on purpose, not because we shared a last name or a childhood address. Slowly, the shape of my days changed. I started cooking proper meals again instead of eating over the sink. I bought a better desk chair. I put up new art in the apartment pieces I actually liked, not ones I thought looked impressive. I went for long walks in the evenings without headphones so I could hear my own thoughts without distraction. Most of those thoughts were still heavy, but they were quieter than before. Healing didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived in small, ordinary ones. The first time I realized an entire week had passed without me once checking whether anyone from my family had reached out. The first time I laughed at something, and the sound didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. The first time I looked around my apartment and felt, not the absence of the people who left, but the presence of the life I had built. I still carried the scar. I probably always would. But it no longer dictated the temperature of every room I walked into. I was rebuilding not the version of me they had wanted, and not the broken version that had spent years waiting for them to change their minds. Just me, as I was, on purpose. A year after the wedding, on a quiet Sunday morning, I sat down at my desk with a blank document open and began to write. I didn't plan it. There was no big emotional trigger that day, no anniversary, no song on the radio, no unexpected photo. I just woke up, made coffee, and felt the old weight sitting in my chest the way it sometimes still did. So I opened a new page and started typing the words I had carried for a decade. I wrote to my mother. I told her everything. I told her how the original email had felt like being erased in real time. How the years of silence had taught me to stop reaching, stop hoping, stop expecting even the smallest acknowledgement. I told her what it was like to build a life from nothing, while carrying the knowledge that the people who raised me preferred a dead son to a living one who chose differently. I told her about the vineyard, about the string lights, about the exact moment her voice cut through the music and finished what the first email had started. I wrote about the anger, the grief, the confusing, stubborn love that had refused to die even after it was clear it would never be returned. I told her I had still, somehow, wanted her to be proud of the life I built, not because it looked like theirs, but because it was honest and mine. I told her that standing there on my sister's wedding day and hearing those 6 words had finally made me understand that pride was never going to come. Not from her. Not from any of them. The letter went on for pages. It was raw, unfiltered, the kind of writing you only do when you know the other person will never read it. When I finished, I sat back and read the whole thing from beginning to end. Every sentence was true. Every paragraph carried years of weight I had never spoken out loud. For a moment, I considered sending it. I even opened my email and started typing her address. Then I stopped. Some truths are not meant to be delivered. Some conversations only need to happen once and only with yourself so you can finally put them down. I highlighted the entire letter, copied it into a new document, and saved it under a plain file name I would never look at again. Then I deleted the original. After that, I took the printed copy I had made, walked down to the building's courtyard, and burned it in a metal trash can while the morning light was still soft. The paper curled. The words disappeared into ash. The smoke rose and vanished. I stood there until the last ember went out, then I went back upstairs, closed the laptop, and made a second cup of coffee. I never sent the letter. I never needed to. Writing it was enough. Burning it was the final act of letting go. Part 9, what I understand now ***. I no longer wait for an apology that will never come. That sentence took me years to earn. It still feels heavy when I say it out loud, but it is true. I used to believe that if I just became successful enough, stable enough, impressive enough on my own terms, they would eventually soften. I thought time would do what conversation never could. I thought the silence would start to bother them the same way it bothered me. I was wrong. Some people are only capable of loving the version of you that fits the story they already wrote. When you step outside that story, their love has nowhere to land. It isn't personal in the way it first feels. It is structural. Their affection was always conditional, even if no one ever said the conditions out loud. I understand that now. I understand that being disowned did not make me unlovable. It revealed the limits of their love. There is a difference, and it took me a long time to stop confusing the two. I understand that the 6 words my mother spoke at the wedding were not a spontaneous cruelty. They were the final, honest summary of a decision the family had already made years earlier. They preferred a clean narrative son who died over the complicated reality of a living son who chose a different life. That choice says more about them than it ever said about me. I understand that my sister's quiet texts and guilty hugs were the most she felt she could offer while still remaining inside the family system. I don't hate her for it. I also don't owe her continued access to my life. Love that requires me to stay small or silent in order to keep the peace is not love I am required to protect. I understand that rebuilding was not a single heroic act. It was hundreds of ordinary decisions made on days when I still felt broken. Going to work, answering emails, watering plants, showing up for friends, choosing not to check old message threads. Healing looked less like a breakthrough and more like a slow accumulation of days in which I belonged to myself. Most of all, I understand this. I am not required to keep the door open for people who locked it from the other side. I am not required to stay soft toward those who chose hardness. I am not required to measure my worth by whether a family of doctors considers me a success. My life is not a failed medical career. It is a completed act of becoming someone I can respect. That understanding didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, the way light fills a room after a long night. And once it did, the old ache didn't vanish completely. Scars rarely do, but it stopped running the show. I still carry the history. I no longer carry the hope that it will be rewritten. That is enough. If you have stayed with me this far, thank you. I want to speak directly to anyone watching this who has lived some version of what I just described. If your family decided you no longer existed because you chose a different path, if you have been erased, rewritten, or quietly removed from the story so that everyone else could stay comfortable, if you have stood in a room full of people who once called themselves your home and realized you had become a stranger to them, I see you. You are not broken for wanting a life that feels true. You are not selfish for refusing to live inside someone else's expectation. You are not required to keep the door open for people who already closed it on you. And you are not less worthy because the people who raised you could not love the version of you that stepped outside their plan. Build the life that feels like yours. Surround yourself with people who choose you on purpose. Let the silence from the ones who left become the space where your own voice finally gets to speak without interruption. I will not pretend the scar disappears. Mine is still there. Some days it is quiet. Some days it still aches when the weather changes. But it no longer decides who I am allowed to become. 9 years after I was disowned, and more than a year after the wedding that finished the story, I can say this with a steady voice. I am still here. I built something real. And I no longer need their permission to exist. If this story helped even a little, if it made you feel less alone, or gave language to something you have carried in silence, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. Leave a like. It costs nothing and genuinely helps this channel reach people who need it. And if you feel comfortable, tell me in the comments where you are in your own version of this. You don't have to share details. Even a simple "I've been there" is enough. I read as many as I can. You are not alone. I'll see you in the next one. Alex.